So thanks for being here. Sorry, really sorry for the long delay. I want to thank all of you for coming this afternoon. Especially want to thank Brian Clack for his role in conceiving this ongoing project on landscapes and human meaning. But also I want to thank Lindy Villa and Maggie McRae for their essential help coordinating this dialogue. I also want to say thanks to Sarah Bain and to Susie Smith for helping to install the nearby exhibition After Icebergs, Conceptual Photography and Climate Crisis. This was done as usual with their good cheer, even while these talented colleagues were installing other important projects throughout the campus. So we're so lucky to have them. I'm grateful. Yeah, let's do that. So as you've no doubt already surmised, Mark and Farrah are not with us. They're in New York, so we already know what technology has done to this gathering, but fingers are crossed that it will continue to flow smoothly. Here's the plan. I'm going to offer some very brief introductions for the benefit of those of you who don't already know Mark and Farrah's work. Then I'm going to ask each of them to speak for about 5-10 minutes, and they're going to have control over the images at that point about their projects and contextualize them for us. And then I've got a few questions, which I think, because I'm so fearful now, I'm just going to stand and ask them from this place. I was going to sit, but I think we won't risk movement. And then you will have an opportunity to ask questions too. So let me begin. And again, thank you so much for being patient and for being here. Mark Dion, quite simply, is one of the most celebrated and busiest artists working today. Dion's work combines passionate research, institutional critique, and masquerade, tongue-in-cheek curation, a generous participatory impulse, and a deep concern about environmental matters. As a result, Dion's work is represented in the permanent collections of more than 50 museums throughout the world, including MoMA, the Centre Pompidou, Tate Modern, Art Gallery of Ontario, the Museum Ludwig in Cologne, Art Gallery of New South Wales, the Seattle Art Museum, the Museum of Contemporary Art in San Diego, and even here at USD's print collection. Dion is the subject of no fewer than a dozen monographs, including a 500-page volume, I'm not going to move, it's right over there, entitled The Incomplete Writings of Mark Dion, and a 1997 eponymous monograph by Lisa Corrin in the Phaidon Contemporary Artists series. His work has been featured in an episode of the popular PBS documentary series, Art 21. Less well-known but relevant to today's conversation, Dion is the co-founder of Mildred's Lane, an experimental cultural organization and residency program devoted to land stewardship and critical social engagement in rural Pennsylvania. Among his current projects, and I'll just mention a couple, though there are many, he has one in Berlin called Delirious Toys, which was curated from more than 70,000 toys in the Stadtmuseum Berlin's permanent collection, which just closed. So if you're getting on a plane, you don't have to go there right away. As did his two-person exhibition with Alexis Rockman, Journey to Nature's Underworld, curated by Lucy Lepard for the Bruce Museum last year. Closer to home, Dion's work will be featured in the Getty's forthcoming Pacific Standard Time programming, thematically labeled Art and Science Collide, where he will serve as the artist in residence at the La Brea Tar Pits. Farrah Karapetian perhaps needs no introduction to this audience since she's a beloved teacher here, but she has led USD's photography program since 2018. Prior to that, Karapetian taught at the Claremont Graduate School and lectured at Chapman University and at the Otis Art Institute. She studied photography first at Yale, where she received her BFA, and later at UCLA, where she earned her MFA. In addition to her teaching, Karapetian is an active exhibiting artist whose cameraless imagery has been the subject of solo and group exhibitions throughout the world, from Los Angeles, California, to Tashkent, Uzbekistan, where she was recently an Art Prospect Research Fellow. Karapetian's longstanding interest in Russian vanguard photographers and path-breaking research on pioneering women within that group has attracted notice and multiple fellowship opportunities, not just here in the United States, but in St. Petersburg and in Moscow as well. Her work today is part of the permanent collections at the Getty, at LACMA, at the Columbus Museum of Art, at SF MoMA and MCASD, not yet at USD, but we can change that, to name only a few of her collections. Her current work explores private space and political faith in multiple contexts, in the context of her own family, as well as transnational precedents from between the world wars. Much like Dion, Karapetian is an active speaker and writer. Her texts have appeared in numerous scholarly and popular journals, including the International Journal for Cultural Research, Archivo, the Los Angeles Review of Books, the Brooklyn Rail, and Novaya Iskustvozniania, which is the new art history in Russian. So thank you, Mark and Farrah, for agreeing to be part of this program. Now I want to give you each a chance to introduce more personally your work for this audience. So Mark, why don't you start? I think you can share the screen and it's all you.
Okay, so I want to talk about polar bears, and largely because the project that's on view are photographs of polar bears, and I don't often do photographic projects, but I do occasionally do photographic projects, and I think the polar bear one is sort of one of my best known, and is one I like the most. But I didn't start working with polar bears in photography. I started really more sculpturally, and so I've been working with the topic of polar bears for a long. The polar bears are, of course, extraordinary. It's pretty easy to do something about polar bears. They're the largest terrestrial carnivore. They're an incredibly charismatic megafauna. They're related to brown bears, but not descendant from brown bears. They're so closely related that they can interbreed with brown bears. And I mean, perhaps most interestingly, there are very few animals that are as synonymous with their environment as the polar bear, to the point that they look like where they come from, right? And so any discussion of the polar bear is also a discussion of the Arctic, right? So already, although certainly global warming was not a everyday conversation in 1989 when I started my first polar bear project, it was very clear that the Arctic was in trouble for a variety of different reasons, and I started becoming very interested about. I was focusing a lot on issues of biodiversity, and there are two areas of biodiversity: the tropical forests, the tropical rainforests, and the Arctic, which were both things that in the past we had, Western society had seen as places that are fearful, places that are extremely difficult to be in and extremely challenging to dominate, right? And so these two things were both in the process of going from places that we needed to be protected from to places that we needed to protect. So an enormous cultural shift in the way we thought about these two environments. So the very first piece I did is this one called Polar Bears and Toucans, which has recordings that I made in the tropical forest, played on these Sony Walkman, carried by this insanely adorable stuffed polar bear, which has its feet stuck in petrochemical tar. So even though I'm now working with the tar pits, I've been working with the material of asphalt and tar since the late 80s. So this became something that I worked on with a variety of different themes. This is perhaps the most well-known of these sculptures that I produced: a very large stuffed polar bear with a Sony portable cassette player in its mouth. Generally my philosophy about art is nothing that plugs in. And so every time I do something that has a component that plugs in, it comes back to haunt me, like this one does, where it's very hard to replace this cassette player and to replace the cassettes. But anyway, this is very much around the issues I was dealing with at the time, issues of biodiversity and the cultural place of conservation. So this is another work which also features a polar bear, called Survival of the Cutest. So it was about how it's so much easier, of course, to fundraise and to set aside land for animals who we find adorable, right? It's much easier to protect things like elephants than to protect the ticks that live on elephants, for example. So a lot of the work I was doing was looking at the conservation community. So some of the projects I do, of course, are sculptural, but I also do a lot of work that has a curatorial function. So this was one of those works called Whiteout, and Whiteout is a project in which I exhibit 100 images of polar bears produced before photography or before the easy distribution of images of polar bears in situ. So they're all in white frames, matted. They're all almost all original prints. And again, what I'm interested in is looking at how we look at polar bears. So they may be taxonomic. At the time, of course, again, the Arctic is seen as a a dangerous, a savage place, and so the bears are often depicted almost demonic, right? They're really fierce, and they're not the kind of pet bears that we see today. Here's some escaped bears on the streets of Paris. So there are 100 of these. They're mostly steel engravings, occasionally chromolithographs, again showing a lot of bears behaving badly or bears behaving as they behave. And again, trying to group them into family groupings, so scientific illustrations, popular comic illustrations, something like this, which comes from Buffon's Histoire Naturelle, polar bears in advertising, polar bears in the family of bears, the Ursus genus. Fanciful polar bears, a lot of fierce polar bears, and polar bears are fierce. They are a super carnivore, right? They are one of the animals that almost entirely survive on meat, mostly on seals, but they'll also eat whale carcasses. They'll hunt whales. They hunt beluga and narwhal, and of course they eat reindeer, birds, Arctic fox. Humans, of course, they are one of the few animals that has no hesitation to eat people. So they are interestingly ferocious, but they are at the time of this work, which is 1992, going through this process of becoming adorable, becoming fragile, becoming something that we really need to take care of, not something that we really need to avoid. So this is very much I don't have great photos of what this piece looked like, but this is a piece in a similar vein in which I collected. This is actually more than 100 photographs of men gloating over the animals that they've killed. So there are works where my process is much more I would say curatorial. So I'm very much a student of natural history display, and I learn a lot from natural history museums. For me, the Natural History Museum is where you get every society's official story of what gets to be called nature at a particular time in a particular place. So I'm looking, as I'm going, I'm seeing different ways polar bears are presented and different messages that are coming with those polar bears and different fantasies. Polar bears are not particularly social, for instance. So these are from around the world. This is actually a celebrity polar bear. This is the famous Knut, who was the polar bear in Berlin that warmed everyone's heart and when it was born, and was front page news often in Berlin newspapers. And sadly, Knut did not had an enzyme which did not allow him to properly process food, and he slowly starved to death in the public eye. So and now his carcass sits in the Natural History Museum in Berlin. So so I did larger pieces of works as well. This is a polar bear in a bed of tar, and she's surrounded by sort of domestic objects that kind of personify her a bit. And of course, I don't use real polar bears. Of course, this polar bear is actually made of goat skin, perhaps perversely. But here you see the first installation of or one of the earliest installations of the polar bear photos, and you see them in white frames with their red labels, and the label gives the name of the polar bear in the country where the photo is taken, then the institution, and then the country. So and there are a lot of these. So this is Florence. This is Bern, Mainz, Bonn, the what is it called, the Institute of Science in Chicago. This was the New York one, and then the New York one was the backdrop was painted, so it's the same bear with a very different backdrop. This was in Stockholm, the hunting museum in Paris, and interestingly, most of these museums have changed now. Many of these institutions have been defunct, so I can often go back, like this bear I just photographed last week in Paris, and it is not it no longer is in this setting, right? And the one from Chicago, that museum doesn't exist anymore. So it is interesting for me to go back and look at these photos that are mostly taken in the 90s. Actually, a lot of them are developed by former UCSD grad Moira Davey, who's a friend of mine who used to do my printing for me, and sadly it's great she's gone on to much bigger and better things, but I do miss her exquisite printing. I think that's about it for my presentation. Oh yeah, 10 minutes. Thank you.
Derrick, can you take over?
Okay, great. Thanks, Mark. That was really interesting. I will share my screen. Okay. This is not ice. This dates from just a little bit before the ice project began, but I thought I'd begin with it because it kind of reveals the same instinct from which the ice project kind of derives. At this time in my practice, and really consistently still, I was really kind of fascinated about the marks that both people, time, and political and personal events can kind of leave on the environment around us. And so this was a piece called Souvenir, which was an episode of the Berlin Wall that had come to Los Angeles, and I had been kind of asked to touch it to see if there was some way in which it could become photographic other than photographing it. And so I kind of transcribed the graffiti that was on the western part of it. And then I also found all of these kind of souvenir portions of the wall in the collection of the Vende Museum. And I transcribed their graffiti as well onto transparent material and photogrammed that transcription in an effort to kind of really touch the surface of the piece and to get back into the moment at which that kind of frustration was exerted on the wall. After having photogrammed it, which just basically means contact printing without a camera, I cut out the object, the photographic object. I call that silhouetting, so that it would become again an object, and I call the object Souvenir. So this photograph is called Souvenir. And I don't know, I guess I also started with this picture because when I walked into the show and I saw the way Mark had kind of handled the prints with the tag so that it seems as if it's speaking the language of the object in the archive as much as the picture speaks to the object in the archive. I kind of find it a pleasurable correlation in the way that those pictures become objects and in the way that my pictures become objects. I've always wanted to handle the photograph as an object, not always as literally as this, not always silhouetted, although there is one piece in the show that is silhouetted, but always kind of rendering the photograph as something that is a unique object. There is no possibility of an addition in this work because they're all unique events that happen in the darkroom, can't be replicated. And that's not just an existential pleasure or a kind of a conceit of the market. It's a question about about how long we dwell with images. It's a question about fact and truth and index. But it's a question that I constantly tease back and forth. And so right after the Berlin Wall project, I was working in New York on a public project where someone had asked me to do something with this atrium, and I looked at this atrium, and it was in a fairly nice part of New York, and I thought of this kind of question of an alternate present. I was thinking about the broken windows theory of 1982 that Rudolph Giuliani had kind of exploited in his policing, where the idea is that if there is a broken window, other windows will be broken. And I looked at these perfectly fine windows and imagined them in a state of entropy, like the neighborhood in which I was working in Los Angeles. And so I ended up photographing my own windows and transposing them onto the windows of the gallery, contact printing those and printing it in there. So if you stood outside this atrium, you would see inside to this kind of exact replica of the window that was your frame, but you would see this kind of questionable alternate present, not necessarily even future. And around the same time, I was asked to work on a piece in Orange County, and I was interested in, again, this kind of question of the site itself, bringing us into the present of what the site was at all. And we're in a museum that has a permanent collection of artifacts of antiquity. What is a ruin? What is our relationship to it? How does it implicate us? And I wanted to recreate one photographically, but I also kind of questioned the possibility of indexing a ruin. Questions of authenticity came up for me, like, what is real? Why is it supposed to be real? Why do we want to see it as real? And so as I began to try to make this ruin, I had to make it from something that would look like the stones of the ruin, but that could transcribe photographically. So I began to work with ice to do that, because ice has an organic kind of composition that looks like stone. And so you can kind of see close up that these rocks that are silhouetted are all made from ice. But as I was doing this and kind of questioning the index and everything, I also began to notice that ice doesn't behave very well when you bring it into a darkroom. It starts to slip around on the slippery color paper, and I was just like totally not behaving. So I had to make that. I had set myself this challenge of making this huge ruin installation, but all my ice was misbehaving, and worked pretty well in the black and white darkroom for some reason. But in the color darkroom, it was making these kind of beautiful messes. And of course, part of art making is just noticing when you're making a beautiful mess and capitalizing on that, seeing where that takes you. And so instead of slipping, letting the ice slip, I began to push it. And so these are called pushes, and the ice began to be pushed around the surface of the photograph. And these are of differing sizes. These are larger and larger. And they began to have this kind of metaphoric meaning for me that I took with me as I moved into a residency in I think this was North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and I began working in their black and white darkroom to think about the ways that these pathways suggested migration. I went on a Pollock Krasner to look at my own family's migration, my grandfathers and grandmothers, where they had come from, how they had moved. And on that trip, talked to a lot of people whose intention was as well to move from Cuba, from Syria, all these different places. Everyone was on the move. And in fact, this is an era in which more and more people, I think the most people ever in history, are living outside of the country in which they were born. And so I began to kind of push that metaphor of migration and the way that materials could suggest it, not only kind of aesthetically or evocatively, but occasionally fairly literally. So this project began to include still cameraless imagery, but from 3D models of safety implements, because one of the most emphatic, repetitious things people said to me was how much they valued safety and what they needed. What are the objects? What are the everyday objects of some of the kind of well, just of their journeys? What would keep them safe? So these pictures began to have more and more ice, more water, and also occasionally safety implements like lifesavers. And I brought it all the way home to ice by casting, in fact, some of the life vests and other objects, and bringing them into the oceans with me to film wherever I was in the world with people. Sometimes this one's not. Until the vests kind of melted away. So it is conceptual photography as the show is framed, but I think from the vantage probably of metaphor, climate comes into it for sure, but mostly in terms of one of the motivations of the people who were migrating. And also, ice was kind of an evocative metaphor for me because of its implications of vulnerability, because it suggested the the kind of mortal power of of timing. How long can you last on this journey? And so I would wait in the oceans with the melting vests until they were gone. And that's what I got for Derrick. That's the story.
That's great.
Those of you who've been part of all the conversations around Frozen Realms this semester have perhaps seen these before in various forms. We looked with Christopher Hoyer at Elias's images of icebergs from his great History of the Northern Folk 16th century manuscript, and saw how these almost abstracted icy landscapes come into a larger idiom of debate about polar regions. And then repeatedly, I think we've looked at this great, one of actually Caspar David Friedrich's largest paintings of the Sea of Ice, also known as the Wreck of Hope, and talked about its relationship to the romantic sublime. And then I think, Fred, you were alert to the relationship between Rockwell Kent and the Greenland ice in your presentation. And so we've been thinking about this for a while, but I'd like to loop Farrah and Mark into this conversation a little bit and see if they would talk about contemporary artists like them who have been concerned politically, metaphorically, with the melting ice, and see if we could draw them out. So I was thinking, Mark, because we talked about it a little bit, Frederick Edwin Church's book, late 19th century book, After Icebergs, with a painter, where he traveled around and created these beautiful little chromolithographs. We've got a copy of that on display in the gallery. But you also reminded me of William Bradford's photographic expeditions to Newfoundland and other places. But I'm wondering if I could ask you both to speak about 20th century work and the kind of environmental angles of artists like one who I admired greatly, Subankar Banerjee, and these kinds of perspectives on glacial melt that are coming up increasingly in the art world, or even maybe more close to your own conceptual efforts, the work of somebody like Ronnie Horn or Olafur Eliasson, who've been sort of pointing at the catastrophe of melting ice in our common culture. And so would you, either of you, like to respond to that? And where you see your work fitting into these trajectories?
Yeah, I'll start just because of the Bradford reference. I grew up in New Bedford and Fairhaven, where Bradford was from, and the first artwork I saw was William Bradford's Sealers on the Ice, which is this incredibly dramatic, great painting from he's a sort of obviously a Hudson River School painter, and it paints this kind of catastrophe of a ship crushed in the ice, and the sealers and whalers have to abandon their ship and go onto the ice. So that kind of sense of drama it's really the first artwork I can recall in my memory, and in some way kind of focused me on some of these issues, and also on the desire to go to Spitsbergen and Svalbard and Spitsbergen, where I've been several times now, looking at actual Arctic uh, landscapes. But I think I'm very close to a friend, my friend Alexis Rockman, who has for the last 5 or 6 years been dealing with some of these issues in painting. And Alexis often, I think when I think about how artists respond to the environmental crisis, I kind of think like it's an all hands on deck situation. I think we do need the kinds of photographers who go to remote places and try to develop a sense of empathy for beauty and the animals and organisms that live in these places. And I think we need people who have practical solutions, who work with engineers and scientists to kind of come up with real significant projects that can change things or even change public perception, like Oliver is doing. And I think we need artists like Alexis who kind of in some way represent what happens if we get it wrong. And we certainly seem to be getting it wrong. And so, and I think that there's kind of room for everyone in that. And I'm also interested, and my perspective is really to look at some of these issues as issues in the history of things, ideas, and images. So, I do feel like you know, we can cast a very wide net for artists who are concerned with these issues, and I'm still a little bit surprised that there aren't more, to be honest.
Yeah, I I agree. I think it's definitely not it's never a question of which is the right avenue towards an end with art. It's always additive. um and even within a smaller kind of perhaps medium specific perspective, since this show happens to both be photographs, if you can kind of narrow it down at all in that respect, although of course neither of our practices, especially David's, is exclusively photographic. Even within that, there are multiple ways to support this question of attention or solutions, or simply how to dwell with the fact of climate change. You need people who will get on a barge and go to the Arctic and shoot these things so that people believe it, because photographs still have this kinds of intrinsic uh, relationship to truth. And despite AI and Photoshop and simply the medium's various capacities since its invention, we all still believe what we see. So we need those people. We need people like Forensic Architecture, which is a fabulous group of artists and architects whose work literally can solve cases, political cases, environmental cases, scientific cases, and I think they've even testified at The Hague. And it is a kind of an artwork that has a solution as an end game, a win. Mine doesn't. Mine doesn't have a win at the end, but what it does is attempt to take the kind of the perspective of the photograph and include the subject when the subject is a person, include the kind of relational hemispheres of photography in its viewpoint. It's supposed to kind of not put not only myself but a viewer in a position of really wondering how this is handled, dwelling on the material as much as the overarching concept. And so I think it's a response to the kind of swiftness with which we view media these days, and the ways in which we can kind of gloss over these things. Certainly for me, it is, as an artist, it's a way to dwell longer with any one person's narrative. be it my own or someone else's.
Part of the reason to pair you two, which in some ways seems like an unlikely pair, is that it struck me that you were both taking, at some level, a conceptual approach to making image about climate change, and as Farrah has talked about, also about migration and the kind of forced migration that climate change is creating throughout the world. But I wondered if you would talk a little bit. It seems to me that you're both using conceptual photography, and Mark, I know you studied, I think, with Joseph Kassuth when you were at the School of Visual Arts. So how important, even though you don't claim to be a photographer, you've done a lot of photographs throughout your careers, and there have been shows of your photographic works. How important is this conceptual approach to making new images for you? And Farrah, I'll ask you the same question. Oh, Mark, you're muted.
One of the things that really attracts me to a sort of conceptual approach is sort of setting the rules for yourself, right? I've always excelled at assignments, and sometimes dealing with white walls as someone who works contextually, that can be a difficult context. And so setting myself an assignment like photograph every polar bear in every natural history museum in every city that you actually end up in is really this wonderful set of rules. And of course, it's something that has an element it's an objective set of rules, but how those photographs are taken is dramatically different. And of course, the conditions could not be more difficult than funky old 19th century museums, which have barely any lighting. And I'm not really a trained photographer. So I'm actually working on a set of, I'm trying to expand the photographs now and working on a new set, but it took me a very long time to track down a fully functional Pentax K1000 that is the camera that I started these photographs in 1990 with. So I'm trying to photograph them with the same, again, making a rule for myself as to how to proceed. And I like that idea. I've often thought that in some way, John James Audubon is sort of one of the first conceptual artists in the American tradition, because he has that idea, like, I'm going to draw all the birds, right? So that idea of setting this goal and then pursuing it and materializing it and having that incredibly strong conceptual spine drive the project is something I think that's very ingrained into the American tradition of art making that starts long before conceptual art and conceptual photography, but certainly carries through that. And maybe conceptual art is where it reaches its apex in a way.
Thanks, Mark. Farrah?
Yeah, the first time someone called me a conceptual photographer was Russia, and the second thing they called me there was a student. A student asked me if I worked in the graphics department and if I did psychoanalysis, and I thought those were three like really interesting. I do it now, but I hadn't at the time. Those were three really interesting responses to the work, because I simply hadn't thought of it that way. I went to undergrad at Yale, where we were using medium format cameras, and my teachers were Greg Crudson, Lois Connor, Todd Papageorge, Philip Lorca de Corsia came through. It was a moment in the late 90s at which the big history painting scaled photograph had taken on this role of kind of not set up or set up or somewhere in between. So very much set up or documentary that suggested the setup. And so I was kind of raised as an undergrad on the idea of this question, of this fine line between fact and fiction in the medium. And then I took the 6 years off, went to Kosovo, really feeling like the photograph itself was something that didn't ever just document, and came back from that trip to Kosovo and kind of made a made a tantrum in the darkroom and made a photogram by mistake because something knocked over on the enlarger, and after that realized that it could be this haptic experience in the present that had a very kind of materialist relationship to an event, so that the photograph became an artifact of a very present event. It didn't happen in two places. It didn't happen when it was photographed and then later when it was printed. It was a unique artifact of that event. And so as I then continued to work cameralessly, as this lovely picture of Man Ray's rayograph suggests, I noticed that my notion of artifact was different from a conceptual photographer's notion of the photograph as artifact. So Jeff Wall has a really wonderful essay about how photography entered fine art through the documentation of land art and performance and conceptual practice. So that, say, like David Hammond's piece with the snowballs, if we're talking about ice, is only accessible to us via the photograph. So conceptual art is usually documented and brought into the institutional space via the photograph. In my case, it is both. It is indeed the artifact of a performance, either mine or someone else's in the dark, but it's also the thing itself, right?
I mean, there is a politics to both of your works, and I was thinking, if before we turn this over to the audience to ask their questions of you, I just wanted to push you a little bit on that, and to what degree is it important for you that these works are viewed in the larger political context of debates about climate change, about urging people to make a difference? And I wondered if you could give us a quick synopsis of how this work feels urgent to you in that political sense, which you talked about a little bit, Farrah, already, and Mark, I think it runs throughout the course of your career.
Yeah, I mean, mine work is Aristotle says that man is a political animal, and I learned that early, so I stick by it. I really believe that photography is relational, that it isn't just me taking a picture of you, that it is about the dynamic between subject, author, and viewer. And so a picture like the one that you're sharing right now, it is an opportunity for me to stop and look at a picture in a newspaper of riot cops in Kyrgyzstan being stoned by protesters. Think of it as a moment of our kind of contemporary politics at the time, the year of the protester, 2011. Think about how protests are seen in public, in the newspaper, in the media. Think about how the triangle of the pediment in ancient Greece used to show moments that were likewise important for the public: war, gods, famine. But they were permanent, right? They were inscribed in stone, in relief, and so how could I make these moments of unrest, of the agency of a people politically, how could I make them more lasting? And so in this case, for example, I asked friends to reenact a picture with which they had very little relation, because they weren't from Kyrgyzstan per se, although they had been to protests in their respective countries. I bought them riot shields and helmets, and told them to wear their hiking boots, and they came into the studio and reenacted this new newspaper clipping. So this is, at a grand kind of history painting scale, because it's 1-to-1 scale with the human body, but it is never purporting. My work is never purporting to document the actual event. It is always purporting to document that process of trying to remember together or enact together. In this case, not an event that they had experienced themselves. In other cases, events people have experienced themselves, whether it's war or labor conditions on cotton fields. I will ask people, how does your body kind of remember? What is a posture that brings it back, whatever it is, and how can I make you an object that will help your body get back into that posture? And so thus the process becomes more and more sculptural. So with the figures, it's always very easy to explain the politics of the work. When it is more abstract, it tends to be easy to get away from that relational question. But I would just say that the relational question for me remains a through line as I explore materials that both metaphorically and eventually, usually literally, contribute to the larger narrative of a project that describes, again, usually, almost always, a circumstance of political faith and an agency of basically an underdog, a story that's not part of a dominant narrative.
Mark, it strikes me that reenactment plays a role in your photography too. So maybe you could bring us home with, your approach to making these relational works, but they're part fact and part fiction, like the one I'm showing now, right? Oh, you're muted again.
Yeah, I think I am certainly very much an artist of the period where I sort of came up, the 80s and the 90s, in that I'm very still invested in this idea of a critique of representation, and I do think that that's a powerful thing, and I don't think it's an exhausted strategy, right? I think that these are real issues of questions of how things are represented, and the stories that images and objects tell, how they are invested with ideology and pseudoscience. I mean, I'm mostly often working with the natural sciences as a uh, as a field, right? And a field that has incredible possibilities for progressive liberation, and has demonstrated in the past and just the worst kind of perversion through pseudoscience and social agendas, right? So in some cases, like in this case, I did a series of photographs of with Morgan Pewitt. We did a group of photographs of scientists who, in some way, are embodying different fields: ornithology, conchology, mammalogy, botany, and we photographed women made tremendous contributions to all of these fields in the 19th century, although almost none of them are mentioned, right? Sort of Mary Anning, who's a paleontologist, is sort of one exception who really somehow has eked into the public view. But in many of these fields, women made extremely significant contributions, and they're often not represented in the way that we think about people like Owen and Huxley and Darwin and Wallace and Cuvier and people like that. So we created a sort of series of cards embodying these in the form of the carte de visite, the sort of cabinet card, and they are impeccably made. And one set is cabinet card size, and it would be a challenge to distinguish them from actual cabinet cards. And we used great women curators as our models. So Ivana Blazwick is the botanist, right? And Lisa Corin is the paleontologist, and they're really wonderful in that regard. They're kind of there's a lot of secret language and in jokes in them, and as there are in cabinet cards, and as there are in still lifes and portraiture. So they're very rich, and in some way, certainly in one of the aspects of this, of course, was a way of acknowledging that there is a wrong that can never be righted, but this is a kind of nod to the fact that there's a problem in the official history of the natural sciences.
That's so nice. Thank you for sharing those projects. I want to thank everybody for putting up with the technological challenges, especially those of you in New York. It's late there, and we're all really grateful to you. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Thanks.